Okay, the woodpile. Okay, so the title is very general. It doesn't really say much about the poem and just describes this woodpile, gets us thinking for what it's going to go on about. So, one of the sort of big themes of the woodpile is this idea of collectivism. Perhaps Frost is being very critical on society. Collectivism is the sort of opposition of individualism. It's this idea of sort of grouping people with a sort of common kind of thing, regardless of race, class, and all this sort of thing. And you could say that there is some kind of sort of negative view on nature, but we'll get into that in a second. So we've got section 1, which is lines 1 to 9. We have this sort of story-like introduction. Similar to like a Once Upon a Time, we have this sort of out walking in, sort of thing. We have this sort of juxtaposition of fantasy and fairy tale with this sort of setting of a frozen swamp and sort of grey, so very dull. So we have this very unpleasant, perhaps negative setting. We have this hard snow. I mean, snow should be soft. And it's very uncomfortable to have this hard snow. It's very uncomfortable and unsettling. It's like it's been there for a while and it's old. And then we have this sort of frozen, the word frozen. And that has connotations of sort of status and indecision, which is even more unsettling. And then we have this sort of 1 foot went through. 1 foot, very sort of shows indecision. It's like they're too fearful to, do both, so it's just one at a time. It's very cautious. And then this snow held me. And held me, there's personification there. It's this sort of fear of control. It's like they're scared and can't move. Okay, next we have the tree. It says too much alike to mark a name or place, which shows something about individuality, conformity, something like that. There's sort of no individuality, perhaps like humanity and like him. And there's this idea of far from home. And there's some kind of adventure suggestion. This a journey. But you could also say this is either of lost, being sort of fearful, because typically we associate home with safety, so being far from home is far from safety, perhaps. And then it says, the view was all in lines, and that's sort of a setting thing. We get this idea of this sort of boxy, robotic kind of mathematical kind of world. It's very regimental and ordered, perhaps like the social systems, so that perhaps something about hierarchy or something like law and order. Perhaps Frost is saying it's repressive and restrictive, if you want to push it there. This idea of view of all in lines is very odd and contrasts with this idea of nature and freedom, the sort of romantic image of, nature. Talking about in lines is very unsettling. It's very uncomfortable as well. He says, I will go on further. And it shows this sort of indecision, like in Road Not Taken. And there's definitely uncertainty emphasised by the modal verbs like shall. Okay, so section 2, which is between lines 10 and 22, with this idea of the bit careful over the line to put, and there's an enjambment there, and perhaps that's reflecting the freedom of the bird, but not him, this sort of enjambment. The bird's free to carry the way I might have gone. And it's showing this idea of his fear can't allow him to go the way he wants, this sort of self-restriction. He's envious of the bird. You could say the bird has been born naturally with wings to fly away freely. And then there's this sort of white, the image of white, which has connotations of perfection, purity, innocence, which obviously contrasts with his sort of setting and himself. And as he says, I forgot him. Is he talking about the bird? Is he showing this sort of regret or this sort of distraction? And then there's careful. So we have this sort of personification of the bird and, showing the sort of life of it. And this sort of carefulness, does that show some kind of mistrusting society as being careful and cautious? You could say he has neglected life. There's also this sort of focus on destruction and sort of pessimism. And then there's this could, a modal verb. It's what might have been, showing regret. We all have fear. Perhaps it's our sort of motivating force. According to sort of this collectivist sort of theory, we could show that all this is sort of learned. Culture is sort of evil because it can't change due to its fear, and it's all about conformity. And then finally we have this sort of good night, which is sort of copied conformity phrase, very learned. Okay, now we get on to section 3, 23 to 40. We have this idea of not another like it. Nature is unique, shows this individuality, which can be applied to humans too. There's no runner tracks, this sort of paranoia, is edgy, and you could argue there isn't any danger, or is there? Okay, then this image of smokeless burning. It's an oxymoron. No oxygen in this sort of smokeless burning. It's very suffocating, it's restricted, there's a lack of freedom, it's very oppressive. Is he for us talking about some kind of oppression in society? I don't know. It can't fulfill its potential because it's smokeless, this burning. Okay, then there's this warm, the frozen swamp. So we have here a circular narrative, repetition of the words, and this sort of warm could indicate some kind of change. And you could say also that there's a rhyme of lines 1 and 40, and that is the only rhyme, which kind of completes the circular narrative. So yeah, that is Woodpile.